unang-una, I think this is a good reminder that we're facing multiple ticking time bombs there in the West Philippine Sea. Of course, the Ayungin Shoal, Second Thomas Shoal, took a lot of our attention over the past 6 months or so because of the multiple incidents, the water cannoning, the disruption of our resupply mission, our hopes to fortify our position there without triggering any kind of conflict with China. But let's not forget, there's also the Reed Bank situation. We still don't know what are we going to do about it. Are we going to develop the resources there? And then not to mention Scarborough Shoal, no? Which is the beginning essentially of a new era in Philippine foreign policy. I mean, after the incident in Scarborough in 2012, the Philippines has not been the same in terms of our foreign policy, in terms of domestic discussion, in terms of awareness of what's happening in West Philippine Sea. Now, going back to this, of course, I defer to the officials to confirm whether what's being reported is the case. But if ever it turns out true, I mean, it's not totally shocking or surprising, right? Because remember back in the day, during the Duterte administration, there were reports by some media channels and journalists about, Chinese maritime forces or fishermen doing something, very destructive to our environment. In fact, there was a study by the Marine Sciences Institute in UP a few years ago that put the ecological environmental damage conservatively at hundreds of millions of dollars annually. So I think this is just if ever true, or even if it's not true, the reality is that we're facing a very difficult condition there in the Scarborough Shoal. If I'm not mistaken, you mentioned Vietnam also may have been involved in this. I think that's another thing that we have to keep in mind because the Vietnam aspect is very important. As you know, President Marcos was just in Vietnam the other week. We discussed maritime security cooperation. We discussed building a common front within ASEAN and beyond ASEAN in dealing with China on a unilateral front. But we also know that, Vietnam also has some overlapping claims with us. And the Vietnamese fishermen have been entering our waters. And there were some deadly incidents in the past. I think 2017, there was an incident between Philippine Navy and the Vietnamese fishermen. So it's not only China, it's also Vietnam, except it's not at the same level. The kind of harassment we're facing from China, the 9-line claim of China is incomparable to what Vietnam is doing. So what that means is I won't be surprised some pro-China elements in the Philippines and propagandists will try to exaggerate any Vietnamese angle possibly to what's happening in the Scarborough Shoal or beyond. So that's the other thing I'm also watching out for right now.
Well, for now, no, Richard, just to clarify for all our viewers, it was a statement of the Filipino fishermen in Bajo de Masinloc. They said allegedly it was Chinese and Vietnamese fishermen, and I think authorities are busy trying to verify that as well as the cyanide fishing accusations as well. But what do you make of that barrier removal? Is that kind of China taking a step back and saying, well, if people do see a barrier, maybe they'll really pin us as the bad guys here? Was it something like that, maybe?
Yeah, I think the Chinese are still scratching their head and scrambling for a response to the Philippines kasi itong proactive transparency initiative ng Philippine Coast Guard, itong mga madaldal natin mga kaibigan na spokesman ng Philippine Coast Guard, the mga others. This is something very shocking to China. I think they've been struggling. Last time I checked, I think even the Twitter account of Philippine Coast Guard was hacked or something, and there was an accusation that some friends maybe from the other side were involved in this. So I think China is really struggling. In fact, I saw some of the commentaries in China recently in some of their newspaper where some Chinese experts are suggesting that it's time for them to show their sword. That's the terminology that they're using. So I'm absolutely certain that there are very vehement debates within the Chinese maritime forces establishment on how to best deal with the Philippines because they're looking for their own Goldilocks approach, right? They want to be tough and strong enough to impress their own people and dissuade the Philippines. At the same time, I think the Chinese also are wondering, I mean, you don't want to give the Marcos administration even more reasons to fortify its relationship with the United States and give more reasons to Japan, Australia, and the US to come to the picture. So it's a very delicate balancing act also on the part of China. But one thing that I think all of us have to keep in mind is that not the black swan, but the gray rhino here is the role of militia forces and some Chinese fishermen who may not necessarily be doing things on the command of the Chinese military or officials. So there's some rogue elements there, including perhaps the one who was behind the Reed Bank incident in 2019. If you remember, we still don't know exactly what happened there. It looks like a Chinese militia was involved in that, and we don't know how much of command structure following and compliance is happening there. So actually, one thing we're very worried about is crazy rogue activities by militia forces or, let's say, overzealous fishermen from other rival claimants there. And it takes just one lethal incident or fatal accident for things to get out of control, especially given how tense things are right now.